Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to call the public safety meeting to order. So welcome, delighted to have you here. We are at our September 22nd meeting. This meeting will be focused on a discussion with the Commonwealth Attorney, Steve Descano. He will be talking with us about some revisions and changes that have been proposed in his office, and he will also talk about some resource needs that are connected to it. So following that, we'll have a brief presentation quickly from Claudia Arco on some of the issues around public safety reform items at the General Assembly, and we will then move into adjournment. So with that, let me introduce our speaker, Steve Descano, who will take about 30 to 35 minutes with his presentation. And with that, Steve, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the rest of the Board of Supervisors for having me. I very much appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to you about the resource needs of the Office of the Commonwealth's Attorney. And so without further ado, I might as well get into this presentation, which, as Mr. Chair said, would take about 30 minutes. And in the presentation, we're going to explore a couple of different things. We're going to be comparing our Commonwealth's Attorney's Office in Fairfax County with other jurisdictions. We're really going to be spending some time taking a look at what is really an unsettling lack of resources in the office. But really, after that, taking a more positive look and taking a positive path forward as to how we can address the needs of the criminal justice system at Fairfax. But to be quite blunt, we are facing a crisis in our criminal justice system, in our prosecutor's office. Now, when prosecutors don't have the ability, the resources to do their work, it makes it difficult to meet our ethical obligations. And what we have is results that, quite frankly, potentially innocent people could be wrongly convicted, or dangerous people can be left out on the street, making our communities more vulnerable. And to be clear, the things that we're going to be talking about, I think it's important to make clear that not casting any type of blame on anybody in this room. I understand that the criminal justice system is very opaque, and that it really is the responsibility of the Commonwealth's Attorney in particular and other people who work in the criminal justice system to shine a light on what the issues are and make people such as the Board of Supervisors aware. And that's what we're trying to do here today. But to be clear, the office right now does not have the fundamental resources necessary to perform the services that our community expects. So the first thing I want to do is to kind of prove that point a little bit, and that is by comparing ourselves to other jurisdictions. Now, as far as the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office goes, by statute, Commonwealth's attorneys are statutorily required to handle felony cases in circuit court, as well as some level of misdemeanor appeals from juvenile and domestic relations court. Everything else is essentially discretionary, and it is up to the locality. So what we have done to try to kind of compare where we're at right now is we've picked our neighbor jurisdictions as well as the top 10 populous jurisdictions in the state, leaving us with 11 comparables, or excuse me, with 10 comparables. And what you can see is that they're color-coded. The reason that they're color-coded is because of the statutory obligations and the discretion on misdemeanors. There's essentially 3 different levels of cases that Commonwealth's attorneys' offices do. And this is as of the beginning of the calendar year. So what you can see is blue. Blue jurisdictions are ones that do all types of cases. That is where Fairfax County was on January 1st. It's no longer there. The green is cases that are jurisdictions that do all misdemeanors and some limited traffic, which is typically DUIs. And red are the jurisdictions that do some limited misdemeanors and DUIs, which is where Fairfax County is right now. And that color code is going to be consistent to the rest of the presentation, so to more be able to do apples to apples comparisons. And you also note that some of them Arlington and Alexandria, they have a /through symbol indicating that they, at that point, or at the beginning of the year, did not have a body-worn camera program implemented at all. So the first thing that we want to show is comparing the total budget, straight line, not broken down per capita at all. And what you'll see here is out of the top 10 largest jurisdictions in the state, Fairfax County has the 8th lowest budget. Now, as you know, Commonwealth's attorney's offices are funded by a combination of both state resources and local resources. And while I think we can all agree that the state funding resource allocation formula is unfair to Fairfax County, uniquely penalizes Fairfax County for being a large jurisdiction, the issue here really is not driven by Richmond. It is primarily a local funding issue. And the reason I say that is if you take a look at the next slide, we broke down the total budget both by local and state. And what you can see is the solid blocks are state funding, where the shaded blocks are local funding. And out of taking a look at purely local dollars, Fairfax County is number 9 out of 10 out of the 10 largest jurisdictions on a straight line basis for funding. Now, we've been talking about straight line, but we all know that Fairfax County is the biggest jurisdiction in the state. As a matter of fact, it's more than twice the size of any other jurisdiction. So when we really break it down by per capita, we can really see the needs and how and the disparity between us and our comparable jurisdictions. We are the blue box on the far left. And what's important is that size really can drive crime to some degree. If everything is equal, you would expect a larger jurisdiction to have more crime than a smaller jurisdiction, and therefore more need. And what you're seeing when you take a look at the purely per capita budget is that most of these jurisdictions have a per capita budget more than 4 times Fairfax County's per capita budget. And if you wanted to take a look at the purely local per capita investment, it really does drive home the point that this isn't solely a state issue. Again, most of these jurisdictions have a local per capita budget of more than 4 times ours. With a per capita investment of $2.74, it's fair to say that a resident of Fairfax County can spend more on a gallon of milk than they will in the prosecution of crime. Now, we've been talking about size, but there are other factors to consider because crime rates do differ between jurisdictions. So we wanted to take into account and show that difference based even on crime rates. And so what we did is we took a look at resource availability per arrest. These are not traffic tickets, or these are actual custodial arrests. And this is important because arrests drive prosecutions. By and large, the cases that we prosecute all start with an on-the-street arrest. And what you can see is that there's not a single jurisdiction that doesn't get at least double what we get in Fairfax County per arrest. And in fact, most get 3 times or more what we get on a per arrest basis. The last comparable that I wanted to show is part and parcel with the arrest numbers. And this is the number of sworn officers on the street compared to the staff of our Commonwealth's Attorney's Office. And I think that this is important for 2 reasons. First of all, number of officers on the street are primarily a local decision. So it's a pretty good reflection, I think, of what the board and what other stakeholders in the county have determined is the proper amount of policing. But also because officers do drive arrests, which again drive prosecutions. What you'll see when you take a look at this is that out of the 10 largest jurisdictions, there's not a single one that has an officer to Commonwealth Attorney staff ratio more than half of ours. As a matter of fact, 5 out of the top 10 have a ratio that's less than 1/3 of ours. And this shows not only how out of balance we are to other jurisdictions, but I think it really can show that we're understaffed compared even to the players in our own criminal justice system, as we have right now only 1 staff member for every 34 officers out on the street. So those are the comparables, but really you can break it down, and that means one thing. It's that we don't have the time to do the cases properly. And the only way to give us time, because we can't put more hours in the day, is to add more staff. And I can tell you that the reason we need this is because without time, bad things can happen. And what I want to do is just take a moment very quickly to tell you what I mean by the bad things that can happen as an on-the-ground conversation. So when I took office, what I found was a prosecutor's office that prosecutors didn't have time to really review evidence and studiously meet all their obligations. And what was happening is that prosecutors were, by not independently reviewing that evidence, they were essentially farming that part of the casework out to officers. Now, I know that probably no one here wants officers to be acting as attorneys, and I share that sentiment, but I can tell you that at that step, in essence, there were officers who were making case decisions as if they were attorneys, without the independent review of the attorneys. And what that led to was a system where one of the primary drivers in the prosecutor's office was simply clearing dockets. And when one of your primary drivers is to clear dockets simply to stay alive because of the volume, what happens is that it creates a system that allowed for two things that really should never happen. It's a broken system that allowed sometimes dangerous people to go free back into our community, and quite frankly, increases the likelihood that innocent people could be convicted and even go to jail. And I know that we like to think that that hasn't ever happened in Fairfax County, but the stark reality of it is that I have seen evidence that that has happened. And I don't want to go into it further. I think we'd have to go in the closed session to do that, but I can tell you that that is a real concern. And that broken system, not only was it broken, but it didn't move quickly. Victims and defendants, victims weren't getting justice immediately. It would get pushed out 1, 2, 3 times sometimes. Cases would take a year and a half, 2 years to finish, if they finished at all, because quite frankly, what happened more often than I think anybody would like, is that victims or witnesses just gave up and they stopped coming to court, and that is how some of these cases got disposed of. Now, once I discovered all of this, this crisis, again, through no fault of the board's own, this is a crisis that I would lay at other people's feet. I took a couple of steps and hopefully created a path forward that we're going to talk about today to try to fix it. And what's important to realize is that this path forward is specifically tailored to Fairfax County. The comparables that I went through earlier are completely unrelated to the suggestions, the recommendations I make, because I don't think that there is a magic formula with a silver bullet. I think that what we needed to do is what we did, which is make recommendations based specifically off of our community, how our courthouse works, and the needs of our actual office. So what I'm going to present to you now is essentially an a la carte menu of options with different timing. And you as the board get to determine, obviously, if having a trained prosecutor handle certain types of cases is something that you feel is important enough for you to provide the resources necessary to do. Now, the goal with this plan forward is ethical, thorough prosecution. And because I want every case that my office touches to be handled ethically, thoroughly, and with the goal of the proper outcome, and not have docket clearing be a prime driver. So the first thing I've done, as you all know, is the step that I've taken is to change the status or change the caseload of what we're handling. Again, Commonwealth's attorneys are only statutorily required to handle felonies and some misdemeanor appeals from Juvenile and Domestic Relations Court. But what we did was actually handling a number of misdemeanors and handling more cases than were statutorily required. Not what we had been handling last year, but what we can handle with what we have available. And quite frankly, the reason that we're able to handle the number of cases, the number of misdemeanor and juvenile and domestic cases that we're handling right now is because COVID created a situation where in our courthouse there were no felony trials for 7 months. As we sit here right now, there are still no felony trials going on, and there hasn't been a felony trial since March. And the felony trials, as you can imagine, are the most important thing that we do, but they're also the most time-intensive thing that we do. But the felony trials, they begin November 1st, or they begin in November. And without more resources than we have right now, we'd have to decrease the caseload even further. possibly getting a lot closer to what is the statutory obligated mandatory minimum. However, we also have a great opportunity here, and it's something I'm really excited about and really positive for. I hope that you all share my enthusiasm for it, is that this doesn't have to happen. A small influx of resources right now, we could actually handle all cases of violence, all cases of sex crimes, and all related offenses for the rest of the fiscal year with a modest influx of resources right now. The reason is because of that COVID backlog I mentioned earlier. We're going to be able to stretch our resources because those 7 months of no trials, my prosecutors weren't just sitting on their hands, they were preparing those trials. So these trials are essentially prepared, meaning that we're able to stretch our resources because a lot of this felony work has already been taken care of while we work through the backlog. So the first thing I want to address is how we get to covering the majority of violent crimes and all sex crimes and related offenses. In the carryover budget, there's an additional 15 staff proposed for our office. And what I can tell you is with that 15 staff, we'll be able to do the current status of what we're doing, but we'll also be able to do all sex cases, related offenses, and most violent cases. Most importantly, I think we can get back. So one thing that we can do, very important, we can get back fully into juvenile domestic relations court. And that may not sound like a lot, but what I want you to understand is that means we're in every single domestic violence case. We're in stalking cases. We're in protective order violation cases. A lot of sex and violence cases run through juvenile domestic relations court because they're family involved. So we'd be picking up a huge amount of that. We'd also by being in juvenile domestic relation court, we'd also be able to get into cases where there's a juvenile who's a defendant. And that's important because that's an investment in our future. Interventions at the juvenile level can be very, very effective at ending recidivism, so a small investment there has a big payoff down the road. Also with this 15, we'd be able to do a lot more in general district court. So for example, we'd be able to pick up every single animal cruelty case that I know is important to each and every one of you, as it's important to me. We've been able to pick up peeping cases. We've been able to pick up all of those types of cases, as well as associated cases that I like to think of as associated with violence that are really important issues right now in our community and really driving things that are happening down in the special session of Richmond, such as obstruction of justice charges and resisting arrest charges. And those are cases that you would want independent prosecutors' eyes on anyway. But that is a great majority of our violence cases, and that's all of our sex and related cases. It's almost all the violence, but it's not quite. To get to all of violence, what we would need is an additional 5 individuals. And that would result in an addition of 20 people to the office. But that 20 people, we would be able to handle all cases of violence, all cases of sexual misconduct, and all related cases for the rest of the fiscal year. Now, the reason, again, that we can do it for the rest of the fiscal year and why that's an important caveat is that felony backlog that I mentioned earlier. That felony backlog, those cases are prepped, but that backlog we will work through in the summer of 2021. So in the summer of 2021, that backlog is going to end. And we won't be able to stretch the resources in quite the same way as we had been while we were working through that backlog. As a matter of fact, we'd have to go back to the pre-COVID asset allocation on felony trials and preparation. Now, what that means is that at that point, to stay in all cases of sex and violence and related cases in perpetuity, forever, it would require an additional 22 staff members in the next fiscal year. Without the additional 22 in the fiscal year, what would happen is because of the need to begin prepping and staffing these felony cases again, we would have to drop back down to essentially what we're doing right now. So in short, all sex, violence, and related cases in perpetuity would require 20 up front and 22 in the next fiscal year. That obviously leaves some cases that I'll talk to you about now. Now, the rest of the proposal is not tied to any timeframes. Again, this is kind of an a la carte menu. The reason I time violence and sex and related cases is because of the urgency of those cases, the urgency that I know we all feel to do those, and also because I was trying to stretch the proposed carryover numbers as much as possible. So that's why I talked about them based on timing. The rest of these things can all be done, of course, on the board's level of urgency at your discretion. The next category would be thefts, property, and quality of life crimes. Now, I think we can all agree that the violence and the sex crimes are most urgent, but I don't want to undersell the gravity of these crimes and the importance of having a prosecutor involved in these crimes as well, because these are crimes that people in our community do care about and would expect help with. Now, to do all of those cases, that would require an additional 19 staff members in the office. And with that, you'll see that on the far right block, the only things left to talk about are traffic cases and full body-worn camera implementation. Now, I want to talk about body-worn implementation first, because I know it's incredibly important to each and every member of the board, and it's incredibly important to me. They're a great tool. They've increased accountability, and they've increased trust, and I think they can continue to do that, and that's a positive step for Fairfax County. But what I hope that the board can recognize is that it's not sufficient just to have footage, but we need prosecutors to review it, to watch it, to redact it, to distribute it, and to utilize it. Because if you don't have that, what you have is just a bunch of footage that is not doing anybody any good. And the role of the prosecutor here, I think it might be necessary to mention that every prosecutor in the office essentially will be a body-worn camera prosecutor. There will be nobody whose job is to watch 40 hours a week of body cam footage, because ethically, the prosecutor who brings the case is the one who has to watch it, redact it, and hand it out that way. So every prosecutor in the office is and will continue to be someone who deals with body cam footage every single day. Now, the body cam issue, it's different than the pre-existing need, and to put it bluntly, even if the board were gracious enough to put in 20 additional staff members, but if you did that and also implemented full body-worn cameras, it would actually put us in a worse position than we are right now. And the gains on the sex cases, the violence cases, and the related cases simply would not be there, because with a full implementation of body cams, we expect a little over 89,000 hours of body cam footage to be handed over to the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office every year. So with all that footage, what would that require? And again, this is at any point in the timeline. You can actually even break this up to coincide it with other a la carte options that you have, depending on what the board wants to do. But it would require an additional, in total, 23 people. And that's not quite far off what the board had initially suggested it would take. Our numbers are very, 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 very minutely off. Again, the body-worn camera issue, though, addressing it without addressing resource deficits could actually make it worse. That's why I would implore the board that it be done in the right sequence, or concomitant with picking up some of the other a la carte options. And of course, the last thing, the only thing left on that box is traffic misdemeanors. And while it's possible to have these cases go forward without prosecutors and be judge-led and have police there without any prosecutors, I have to say that I think we can agree that police already wear a lot of hats. They have enough to do, and asking them to fulfill the role of prosecutor to some regard is not the best option for the police department, nor necessarily for the community. But again, it's traffic. There's a lot of traffic cases. It's a huge driver of our cases, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of cases actually, and they make up more than 50% of the body-worn camera footage we'd receive, as well as making up the majority of in-car cruiser video that they'd receive. So with that big caseload need and that big evidence need, if the board were so inclined that they would want to have prosecutors do traffic cases, that would be an additional 53 people. Now, again, the goal of all this is to focus on ethical and thorough prosecutions. Addressing the staff needs, the shortage, would actually, for the first time in decades, really get this office to doing what it was supposed to be doing it, and not just taking shortcuts, actually getting to real justice. Now, I understand that the numbers are big, but I do want the board to know that when we put these together, we did it in the most fiscally conservative way possible. So what we presented, essentially, there are no bells and whistles. This is meat and potatoes prosecution. We also did it with an eye towards support staff. One of the shortcomings that we have in our office right now is that we have almost no paralegals and no support staff. And what that means is that we have attorneys who are paid a higher attorney salary. They're doing support staff work. So what we did when we put together the recommendations is we tried to have the work get done by as many support staff as possible, because obviously they make a lower salary, limiting the number of higher salaried prosecutors to the bare minimum to try to make this number much, much more manageable. And you can see that we did that because it's actually borne out by the comparisons, borne out by some of the metrics that we talked about before. So on a per capita investment, what you'll see here on this chart is that on the left, Fairfax County changes to green and then blue on top. Green would be the per capita investment if we had full body cam programs and we did everything except for non-DUI traffic cases. And what you can see is at that level, we are still number 9 out of 10. We're 9 out of 10 on per capita budget with that level. And even if you wanted us to do all the traffic and added that expense, we would only become middle of the pack. You take a look at the arrest breakdown, essentially the same thing. With us doing everything except for traffic cases, we're middle of the pack on a per arrest breakdown. And if you added in traffic cases to that, we still would not crack the top 1/3. And then lastly, the comparing to the uniformed officer ratio, it's the same as the other comparisons. If we did everything except non-DUI traffic, we're middle of the pack. And if we were to do traffic, we don't crack the top 1/3 of the 10 largest jurisdictions. So as you can see, we did make an effort. I did make an effort to not make this extravagant. This is meat and potatoes, and it really does put us middle of the pack here. So in summary, the overall ask is for everything, for all misdemeanors, all felonies, all body worns, and to really get a functioning justice system, it's a need of 84 additional staff members. To add traffic to that, it would be a total of an additional 137. But I do want to point out the immediate need where we can stretch the most and handle the cases that I think that everybody in this room is most concerned about, which is 15 in carryover, an additional 5. Now, I know that this is an uncomfortable conversation. It's not a conversation that anybody wants to have. And I think it's a reason why it had never been had by somebody in my position before. And quite frankly, it's distressing to me that we're in the position that we're in right now, and I have to have this conversation with you with these numbers on it. But what I hope you all recognize is that I'm always going to be honest with you about where we are. I'm always going to be honest about what we're doing well and where we need help. And I hope that that goes both ways, and I'm sure that it will. And I'm very much looking forward to answering your questions again in an honest way. So thank you very much for the time to present, and I'm sure that you all have a lot of questions which I would love to answer.
Okay, I'll say thank you to Mr. Descano for that very detailed and insightful presentation. And I'll say it's very comprehensive as well. What I'll note, though, and I guess this is the elephant in the room, there's some big numbers in this document, and we have some challenges as we think about the upcoming fiscal year. So FY 2022, we've not yet begun that, but we are in the midst of looking at what the impacts of the budget are and how we're going to address all of the needs across the county. So I'll say, recognizing the point you made on the 15 positions in carryover, and I think those on this board would say, traditionally in carryover, we've not committed to recurring expenses. It's usually just a one-time shot. And in this case, in looking at this, we are basically suggesting that those positions would be carried into the FY 2022 budget, which means we'll have to find money for those. And I'll be honest in saying right now, I don't know what the current situation is with our revenue generation. I have not, and I know we'll be having some discussions in our next meeting about this as well, but we've got some significant issues here. So with that as kind of a backdrop, recognizing that this is extremely important, let me ask a couple questions. I'll start with you, Steve, and then I'll probably ask the staff to join in here as well. I know that when you're talking about your budget, there's kind of two parts to it, and you've alluded to the comp board and made it clear that the funding level is pretty woefully inadequate, placing us somewhere around the 8th place of the 11, including Fairfax County, in the comparable jurisdictions. Help me understand. I guess we're going to have some advocacy, and we talked about this in our legislative session before. But what are your thoughts on this too, in terms of being able to secure additional funding at the state level from the comp board to help us address this issue, which is really not solely a Fairfax County issue, it is also a state issue?
No, that's absolutely right. And I think that this is an issue that I've spoken to some of your colleagues about, as well as you, Mr. Chair. Fairfax County is punished by the state for being what's called a super jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. And what needs to happen to really fix the issue is two things. First of all, what I'd ask everybody to understand is there is a mathematical formula for the number of positions that are funded by the state. And that mathematical formula is driven by a couple of things. It's driven by the number of felony defendants that make it to circuit court, as well as felony sentencing events. So what that does is that cuts against us being a more progressive, not office, but jurisdiction, because one of the things that cuts against it is one of the things that I know that everybody in this board who was here before sees as a feather in their cap, which is diversion first. Yeah. So every time we divert someone from our criminal justice system, those are dollars that we don't get from the state, because the state doesn't view that as work being done, even though those cases actually take a lot longer to do. There's also another part of it that's based on the size of essentially the size of the jurisdiction, where Fairfax County is the only what's called super jurisdiction. There is, and there have been, and this would actually be a great place for the county's legislative staff to engage on. There was a bill in the last session to change that funding formula, to essentially take it away from the comp board and bring it back to the General Assembly. And what had happened was the Virginia Association of Commonwealth's Attorneys talked that patron, one of whom is Fairfax County's own, Marcus Simon, yes, into holding off on that bill for a year to try to come up with a VACA comp board funding. I've sit on that committee. I don't think that committee is going to deliver in a few months what the patron is going to want. So what I would suggest is that we have the opportunity to really push on that particular legislation, to bring that back, so that Fairfax County can actually have its delegates and senators fight for the resources that we need. Yeah. I would imagine, based on conversations that I had, that while that would be very helpful, I would not expect an addition of any more than, say, a dozen staff members from that process, but a dozen is nothing to sneeze at. The other part of that is, and this is another legislative fix, is that math formula, it doesn't spit out a number that you get, it spits out essentially a percentage of the pie that is voted on every year by the General Assembly. So pushing on the General Assembly to enlarge that pie by adding more prosecutors that are funded through the state would also be a second step that could actually be a more dramatic increase in state funding. Okay.
And then just thinking about the other side of the funding for the office, being that local share, looking at some of the, I don't want to use the word successful, but the jurisdictions that have higher investment, both at comp board and also at the locality, what was their sort of process for maybe growing their office to address the needs? Do you have a sense of kind of, was it more gradual, or do we see a need to have like an infusion of capital similar to what we're talking about here with your presentation?
That's a great question. And, it's actually, I kind of alluded to it at the end when I said it's a real shame it never should have got this way.
Yep.
The leadership of the former Commonwealth Attorney's offices should have come, and over time, over years, as things happen, as new technology got added to the system, asked for, I need one or I need two this year. And over a long period of time, we would be funded as to where we need to be funded. We wouldn't be having this shock moment with such a big number. I think that most jurisdictions that have done that have built up a good relationship between their local governing board and the Commonwealth Attorney's Office to have these gradual year-over-year conversations. Now, however, there are some exceptions, particularly around the implementation of body cams.
Yep.
Those have all come in giant chunks as body cams have hit the street. But I agree with you that the better way forward would have been years of asking for one or two here and there. It's just unfortunate that because that didn't happen in the past, we're at the situation right now, kind of in the crisis that we find ourselves.
Okay, and I'm going to get you guys just couple more questions. Just trying to understand the ask in terms of the additional staff positions, just so we all have a sense of what that value is. Mm-hmm. So I think we have someone from the Office of Management and Budget who can help us maybe walk through each step of the ask, starting with the carryover, and then adding the 5, and then adding the additional employees as has been suggested in the presentation.
Hi, Kim Panzer with Management and Budget. If we want to start on the slide that references the 15
Yes.
in the FY21 carryover package, 15 positions are in there at a reduced amount because it's for partial year. But if we look at the full year commitment for FY22, it's about $2 million.
Okay.
If we add the additional 5, that brings us up to a total of $2.7 million.
Okay.
If we move to the next 22, that brings us to a recurring amount of $3.1 million.
Okay.
The next slide will add an additional 19. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Go back. The additional 22 will add 5.8 million. Will be 5.8 million.
Yep.
Add the additional 19. We're at 8.3 million. The additional 23, bringing us to the total of 84, will be 11.5 million. And then the total 137 is 19.1 million.
Okay. Okay. That's helpful. Thank you. So let me now ask. I guess this is a tougher question too, but maybe I'll start with you, Steve. Just recognizing that the decisions that have been made currently in the Commonwealth Attorney's Office have created some kind of ripple effects to the county. So we've talked to a number of police officers, and they've talked about kind of some of the misdemeanor cases that you have now decided not to prosecute, and a number of those have now become kind of the responsibility of the staff. Help me understand, just from your perspective, and I'll ask our staff, but from your perspective, what's been the impact to the police department as a result of the decisions that have been transpiring in your office?
Yes, that's a great question. And, again, as a preface, I do want to make clear, of course, not that this was implied, but these decisions are not philosophical. These are decisions that I would not want it to have take it all. These are decisions that are driven solely by budgetary constraints and ethical obligations. As far as the effect on the police, it's and the community, it's been great. It's been a great effect. And by great, I mean immense. I've had conversations with a number of officers a number of representatives from the police department, and it is the number one thing that they talk about. Because it is not only an immense amount of work for them, but more to the point, it's not the workload, which is great, but that's not what they're trained to do. They're doing work that they feel, quite frankly, that they're incapable of doing as well as prosecutors, quite frankly, could do. And the result of that is potentially cases ending in the wrong result, losing cases that should be convictions, and of course hurting the community in that way. So I don't think that there's a single person here, myself included. I do not want police officers to be in that position. It's not a goal of mine. It's not a desire I have. And I think that the community would be better off if that was not the case.
Yeah, I mean, I'll echo that point as well. I mean, personally, I've said this in the meetings that we've had with police staff, and that is, this is not an area that they should be required to handle. I mean, this is not normally within their daily work, and we've got to find another solution.
So one last thing, I agree with that 100%, and just because that is permitted and just because that is the norm in other jurisdictions around the state,
Yeah.
I don't, as Fairfax County, we would try to be a leader on that. So I would agree with that 100%, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. And almost there, guys. So the last question I'll ask you, Steve, and then I'll ask the staff. So in terms of support to the officers, if they have a need with either discovery or some area as it relates to appearing in court, what service, what assistance or help are you able to provide?
Quite frankly, at this moment, we're able to offer less than what I would like. And here's the reason why. There are a number of judges who have gotten used to the way that things are and are looking for any opportunity to drag Commonwealth's attorneys back into these cases. And it is judicial prerogative that once we touch something in a case, such as with discovery, that we would need to go and ask judges, can we get back out of this case? As of right now, they have been very clear that if we do so much as even touch a case, that we are going to be in that case. And it has put us in the awful position that we are not able to flatten out the work and try to pick up and help these officers do the work. I am open to doing it. I want to do it. I understand that because of the issues with the budget and the board has, that anything would be a ramp up. And I want to try to help make that as smooth as possible. So what I need to do is continue to try to work and try to get an understanding with the judges that would allow us to do that, because that right now, again, it's not philosophical. It's that practical reality that is keeping us from helping the officers in this particular arena.
Okay, so with that backdrop, let me ask our staff, and that'll be, I think, Dave Rohr, Deputy County Executive for Public Safety, and then maybe Chief Rossler from the Chief of Police, Fairfax County Police Department, and then Beth Tier, our County Attorney. What's been the impact to us from the standpoint of the police, and kind of what have we done in response? And then if you want to share any other thoughts in terms of maybe future actions that we might consider.
Thank you, Chairman. And Dave Rohr, Deputy County Executive for Public Safety. I'll speak to a number of my concerns, but I'll, from a broader perspective, because it does impact other stakeholders, not just the police department. And I'll allow Chief Rossler to speak to them and some of that. Yep. First, based on the presentation and some of the words that were used in there, in case anybody's watching, I just want to say, from my perspective and my opinion, I just want to speak to any perceptions that the former prosecutors, either Robert Horan or Ray Morrow, were in any way unethical or lacking integrity. I'm not saying it said that. When I see the words, I just want to make sure anybody watching, and again, it's based on my experience. I was a police officer, I was a commander and chief, and I worked with them in cases and on many issues, and I only observed the highest integrity and ethics, by them and their staffs. Ray Morrow and Casey Lingen, most recently were partners with us in Diversion First, in specialty dockets, and certainly in launching the body-worn cameras. I'll also note that Ray Morrow, Mr. Morrow, and his team, including Casey, identified staffing needs for their office in both the 2014 5-year public safety staffing plan, one of the first things I worked on in this position. And then again in 2017, we were asked to come back with a quote-unquote constrained staffing plan. They identified needs in both of those plans. So this is not the first time this has been raised, and they were not ignoring the needs in their office. Certainly, and I appreciate, as to my other concerns, Mr. Descano and I have had conversations and very candid, and I appreciate that. And I'm certainly confident that we'll continue to have those conversations and work on these issues going forward. One of the concerns that I have shared, and is what I believe to be less advance notice than we needed to prepare for this. This is a significant shift for the courts, for our defense bar, for the police department, and many other stakeholders. And we could have used more time to work on this to get our solutions ready. Again, to develop the appropriate guidance, the policies, the procedures, and the training for officers, in my opinion, just required more time to do it right. These changes, as I've said, don't only impact the police department, but they impact other stakeholders, including the courts, the defense bar, the public defender's office, and the office of the court clerks, other county agencies, and other law enforcement partners, including the sheriff's office, fire marshals, and the Virginia State Police. Again, I'll allow Chief Rosser to say further, but we do have a responsibility, and this has been mentioned, to prepare our officers and detectives and to protect them from any allegations or appearances of the unlawful practice of law. Again, there will be, I know it's been discussed that perhaps the county attorney's office could pick up some cases as one of the options. Obviously, as you've heard previously or seen, there would be a potential impact, obviously, on the county attorney's office, as she too would need positions to handle any additional prosecutions. If she was asked to do that, those that are traditionally handled by the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office. And there are also limits to what her office can prosecute in courts by code or by statute. Similarly, there will be a potential adverse impact on the overtime costs for the police department if officers and detectives have to spend more time preparing for or attending court appearances. For not only, their assigned days or trials, which they do now, but for motions or other matters they do not have to currently attend quite often. It's handled by the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office. Just as importantly, this may have one of the intangibles. It may have an adverse impact on the rest cycles for officers who may work evenings or nights or are on days off and may have to attend court more often. And finally, well, not finally, but importantly, I do want to, and it's been mentioned, and I appreciate, again, our candid conversations, and it was in the presentation by the Commonwealth's Attorney, Mr. Descano. I do want to voice my concerns for victims and witnesses. I strongly agree that defendants should be treated with fairness and without bias and have adequate due process. But we must continue, and we must continue to enhance alternatives, as we have been now for a number of years, to alternatives to prosecution and incarceration. But there are serious crimes, including serious misdemeanors, that must be addressed. And again, some of these have been mentioned already, so I appreciate that. I am concerned a little bit as to the loss of a balance in the treatment of victims and witnesses. Victims have legal rights that we must meet, as well as our moral and ethical obligations to them. They deserve respect and dignity. And certainly in Fairfax, and we've discussed this, cases include victims and witnesses who may be low income and are non-English speaking, and they do not have the resources for an advocate or representative, and may not always understand what is happening in a court proceeding. This is putting more pressure on our respective victim services units, not only in the police department, but in the Department of Family Services and elsewhere. You know, as one of many here who are concerned about the full spectrum of domestic violence, dating violence, elder abuse, and child abuse, you know, I am concerned that only intimate partner domestic violence is included in cases for which the Commonwealth's attorney will participate. You know, I'm glad for that inclusion, but obviously there are other types of relationships, and there are far too many reported domestic violence cases or related cases, which can and have led to more serious crimes or more serious consequences. These cases have a tremendous adverse impact on victims, families, and children across our community. And again, as has already been mentioned, but I'll just kind of go through some of the other more serious misdemeanor cases that we're concerned about, to include, but not limited to, indecent exposure, peeping, misdemeanor indecent liberties cases, contributing to delinquency of a minor, unlawful entry, unlawful creation of an image of another, firearms crimes, including brandishing or possession of concealed weapons, gang solicitation, and animal cruelty cases. And the last thing I'll say before I turn it over to Chief Rossler, I mean, it's been mentioned in the context about the 15 positions that were included in the carryover discussion, which we have coming up next week. We put those in as county staff to address the request by the board to reinitiate and move forward on the body-worn camera program and to begin to accelerate particularly a few of the patrol stations as soon as possible. So those 15 positions were intended to relaunch the next phases of the body-worn camera program. So we'll need guidance as to how the board wishes to proceed on that. So with that, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Chief Rossler?
Well, good afternoon, Chairman, Board of Supervisors, guests. We've had a PowerPoint presentation by Deputy County Executive Rohr, and there's a lot of information in there. And as your Chief of Police, listening to the officers, the great victim advocate staff, and our advocates in the community, victims, you've heard that there is impact, and that's the question posed by the Chair of the Public Safety Committee, Mr. Lusk. And your great women and men of the Fairfax County Police Department, including our professional staff, led by Sally Fayez of Victim Services, are all dedicated to equitable justice. And that's what we do each and every day. And we understand the challenges as presented today for staff and for the Office of the Commonwealth Attorney, and also there's other impacts in court services, the public defender, and all that are in the corridor of traveling through the justice system. For us in the police department, we're grateful, especially to employee group leaders and other officers, victim advocates, Director Fayez, the county attorney's office, and staff from the Office of the Commonwealth Attorney to help us develop a robust and active training plan, because yes, we do not want our officers in the awful position of being accused of practicing law in the courtroom, which has been mentioned at least 3 times here today. So that training is ongoing and active, and I appreciate all, including the great officers of the department, especially seasoned detectives that have that unique courtroom experience to get out and about virtually to train all our officers. Yes, we do understand that's the day-to-day operations in other jurisdictions, but it's catching up to the training that we're in that mode right now. And clearly it has impact on our Criminal Justice Academy, as we have 95 plus officers navigating through academy sessions right now to become street effective. So we're having to wedge that in thanks to the support of many agencies here today. But the bottom line is having the highest quality of equitable justice as the outcome in every single case for the victims in our community, the witnesses, our pet community. That is so critical. That's what we have been doing since July 1st, 1940. We shall continue to do that. And clearly, again, understanding the staffing challenges to ensure that the future of this great county continues to remain safe and deliver equity for all victims and witnesses. So we're very careful through this navigation that we put team spirit as number one. We all need to work together, and I assure you we are working together to bridge the gaps that have been rapidly thrust upon us to continue that. But the number one thing as the chief of police right now is the morale impact of this. It's very frustrating for officers to all of a sudden have great casework, come to the courtroom, and no longer be able to depend on a prosecutor in the courtroom and to have to face a defense attorney. And we have victims and or pet victims there. And our skill level is not at the highest legal level like a prosecutor, very professional staff. And we're hopeful that somehow this difficult adult discussion leads to bridging some of these gaps in the immediate future. So thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Chief Rossler. And then maybe I can ask if Beth Tier, our county attorney, can take a couple minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. You asked specifically about the impacts on our office, and so I did want to note that Senior Assistant County Attorney Kim Balcom, in particular, has spent a great deal of time and effort putting together additional training for our police officers to be able to go into court and handle these cases. I think the board's aware that historically our office has handled all of the county's civil legal work. This office has never prosecuted in any criminal cases in any criminal court. And although we'd be happy to expand our scope if the board wanted us to, I think it's important to understand that we are not staffed to handle criminal prosecutions currently. And the litigation attorneys in my office in particular already log significant amounts of overtime, which we bill in the form of comp time on our timesheets. And so I didn't have any attorneys, unfortunately, who were sitting around looking for additional cases to come in the door to keep them busy. And I do want to make that clear from the outset. So adding misdemeanor prosecutions to the list of items that my office handles would frankly generate a similar need for me to hire attorneys as Mr. Toscano. And these attorneys would need to staff the various courtrooms that operate simultaneously throughout the day, hearing traffic and misdemeanor cases. And as I'll further explain in a moment, there would be a certain amount of inefficiencies involved in staffing up my office to handle criminal prosecutions, and especially with regard to the fact that my office couldn't handle every criminal prosecution that exists, even if we wanted to. Overall, though, I'd like to stress that we would likewise need to engage in ethical, thorough prosecutions. There would be no shortcuts in my office, and like Mr. Toscano, that involves additional staffing. So what is the extent of our authority to prosecute as county attorneys? According to the Virginia Code, and specifically Section 15.2-1542, county attorneys may prosecute violations of the Virginia Uniform Statewide Building Code, the Statewide Fire Prevention Code, and all other ordinances. And notably, absent from this statute is any authority for the county attorney to prosecute violations of the Virginia Code. And I do want to emphasize that it's been mentioned that domestic assaults are an area of particular concern. My office is not statutorily authorized to prosecute domestic assaults. And we couldn't, even if we wanted to, go into a criminal court and handle those cases. Now, turning to some of our research that we did about other Virginia county attorneys' offices, there weren't a huge number in our research that handled criminal prosecutions, but those who did generally pursued violations of the Virginia Uniform Statewide Building Code and the Statewide Fire Prevention Code. And occasionally there were stormwater management ordinances that were enforced by the county attorney's office. And you can easily see why that is. It's consistent with some of our code enforcement work that we already do. A few jurisdictions that we located had their county attorney handle animal cruelty charges, but those were generally based on a very strong, robust local animal ordinance. And in Fairfax County, our cases are typically charged under the Virginia Code. And it would take a considerable amount of amendment of our county code to get us to a place where we could engage in any sort of robust enforcement of animal cruelty cases. I did want to note that city and town attorneys have very different authority under the Virginia Code. They generally are authorized to handle a fulsome docket of criminal cases, including misdemeanor cases that relate to violations of the Virginia Code. Again, however, a county attorney is not given this latitude. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be more than happy to follow any direction that's set by the board, but I just wanted to put out some of the major points about the degree to which my office could step into this situation to try to assist in prosecuting misdemeanor and traffic offenses.
Okay. Thank you very much for that clear and concise presentation. Why don't I go ahead and go around the horseshoe here? So we'll start with the chair.
Thank you, Chairman. First, I think we're all kind of in a little bit of state of shock here. So let me acknowledge that. I do appreciate the Commonwealth's attorney coming forward with data that we can look at and presenting a problem that, is serious. I will say, though, I think everyone has seen from this conversation that the level of coordination with so many different affected parties, many of whom are in this room, needs to happen. It needed to have already happened. And it needs to happen, and somebody's got to come to us with a plan. Because the challenge with this is, I went back and looked at the Commonwealth's attorney's budget, and while it is at the numbers that are in here, it has doubled in the last 10 years. So it's not, as if there were no efforts to increase the Commonwealth's attorney. It's 50% larger today than it was 10 years ago. And if we move forward with carryover, we would be increasing the Commonwealth's attorney's budget in one action by 40%.
Right.
And so it is, the numbers that we're dealing with here are unprecedented. There's no doubt about that. I mean, clearly, as you acknowledge, we don't typically do that during carryover, encumber ourselves with recurring costs. And, this is the second highest number of positions in carryover. The only thing that's ahead of that are health department employees responding to a pandemic. And so, I do think we had to be mindful of the fact that here we have, a presentation, but we need a plan.
Yes.
And we need a reasonable plan that has an understanding of all the different agencies that we talked about here, what their responsibilities are going to be moving forward to make sure that egregious cases don't fall through the cracks. And not only do we need a plan, but this board needs time to try to figure out what our response to that plan is going to be. Because as the county attorney just outlined, we can't just start doing these things. I mean, we don't even have the legal authority to be able to do that in some cases. And so this, to me, while it is an emergency situation as we sit here today, we're not going to be able to respond to it in the emergency way that we might think because of the magnitude of the problem. And that's where we need a bridging plan to reassure our public that egregious violent cases aren't going to be falling through the cracks as we move forward, and that if we make an enormous investment in police-worn body cameras, that we're not making that investment just so that the evidence can be ignored. I mean, that would not be a smart maneuver either. So we definitely need a plan. I guess some of the questions that I have is right now, within the budget of the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office, how many staff members do we have today, and how many are attorneys that handle cases?
Well, Chairman McKay, we have a little over 45 total staff members in the office, and that breaks down to line attorneys of a number of 32. So we have, again, we are very attorney heavy, whereas in other jurisdictions there's more of a better ratio, but again, the great majority of our staff members are those handling cases on the front lines every day. But it does have the unfortunate effect of they're also picking up non-attorney work, which makes them less effective on a dollar basis.
So the other question I have is in these charts with the COVID-19 effect, I mean, I appreciate that because obviously these are different times than normal. If the carryover funds are approved and we add the 15 positions that are in what the carryover proposal is at this point, is what you're saying is none of those 15 positions would actually be utilized for body-worn camera footage, but you would have to take those 15 positions and triage them into the most violent of crimes that are committed.
That's correct. What we would do is we would triage those into the most violent crimes. There would be a mix of attorneys and staff members. But again, we already have 1/3 of the body-worn cameras out on the street, so every attorney position is a body-worn camera attorney position because ethically, the attorney who prosecutes the case, even if it's just to make a plea offer and take a plea, has to be the one that watches and reviews that footage. So definitionally, every prosecutor is kind of a body-worn prosecutor, but if we added the 15 and all body-worns on top of it, our position would be worse because we would already need that 15 to triage.
Okay. And my other question, I guess I'm focused on the slide about the 15 positions because I think in the short term, not to prejudge the action of this board, but, assume that's likely. But, beyond that, I think as the Chairman Luss pointed out, our budget situation is an enormous question mark, as it is everywhere in the world right now.
Yep.
So we're not different in that from that standpoint. But when I focus on the 15 and we say covering all sex crimes and a majority of violent crimes, do you have any order of magnitude how many crimes that you have characterized as majority would not be covered? I mean, how many cases we're actually talking about? And then secondarily, I think we need some reassurance that in this interim period of time, that while these lines are clear in what these cases are, but as Mr. Rohr pointed out, some of these could move from one column to the other in terms of whether they're a real threat to public safety in our community or not. And so do you maintain the flexibility if you move forward with the 15 of deciding categorically in here which crimes you consider to be violent enough to prosecute and not necessarily just fall neatly within these topical areas that are on here, because we know every case is unique?
That's right, and those are great questions. I'll take the second one first, because that is a concern. As a matter of fact, if you were to take a look at our caseload, the last thing is cases that within my discretion we would do. So right now, even though we have the limited list of cases, we've actually worked a great working relationship so far with victim witnesses and other police liaisons, where we already are picking up cases that may not be on the list that we do. So, for example, we have gotten into some particularly egregious animal cruelty cases. We've gotten into some domestic violence cases that aren't necessarily intimate partner. We've gotten into elder abuse cases. So we're already doing that, and we would do that. What the goal is to anything that is violent, sex, or adjacent. That's why we put related. With a complement of 20, we would be able to handle everything that is not a violent crime, anything that's not a sex crime. So we wouldn't be limited just by categories. I'm telling you right now, I'm telling the board that we would pick up all of that, regardless of how it looked on a chart. As far as
And you are planning to continue to do that, correct? I mean, that's something that you hope to be able to continue to do.
That's correct.
To have that ability to look at these, not necessarily topically, but look at them in terms of impact on the community.
Absolutely. The impact on the community is always the thing that we're front and center. And the list here by category is almost shorthand. For people in the office and other stakeholders. And I think it goes to your point earlier about coordination. Explaining that a little bit better is something that I know my staff and I have endeavored to do with the other stakeholders in the justice system, particularly the police department. And that's why we've been able to pick up some of these other cases, because once we explained a little bit further, we got more communication back to pick up some of these additional cases. And, Mr. Chairman, you asked about the additional 15, and I'm sorry.
Yeah, my question is the header says covering all sex crimes
That's
and a
right.
majority of violent crimes. And I guess my question is how many, that's a majority, so a
Right.
minority of violent crimes is inferred would not be handled. And so what is the order of magnitude there? How many cases are we talking about?
Okay, excellent. Yes, I apologize for forgetting that. The things that fall outside of the majority would be assault cases. And with assault cases, that is one of the largest number of arrests every year. What we see is that we average roughly 41 assault arrests per week. Now, not all of them get handled in general district court. By stepping back into JDR court, where more than half of those are handled, we'd be handling a lot of assault cases. We project that with the 5 necessary, or the 5 that we asked for, that would be what we would need to do the rest, which we estimate to be 18 assault cases per week in general district court.
Okay. Last thing I'll say is really just a request. I mean, honestly, we need to be having a team here of some of the stakeholders in this room working on this and coming
Right.
back to us with a coordinated
Yep.
plan, because what is clear is no matter what we do here, we're going to affect another agency. And what we need to understand is what exactly we're getting for our investment. Is it best used in this area versus this area? And, we need some semblance of a plan, and we need the people in this room who are stakeholders to be coming together to come up with that plan so that whatever the board does is comprehensive and it's actually doing what our intention, as we all talk here collectively about doing. And we need to make sure that we do that. I realize that's going to take some time, but honestly, it's more important now than ever in the constrained fiscal environment that we're in, that every dollar we invest is a dollar going towards a cause that this board has embraced, and so and largely our community has embraced. And so I would hope that as a result of this, we would put together the right
Working
team
group.
here, and I'm happy to
Yes.
work with Chairman Lusk on
Yes.
that, put together the right team of stakeholders to come back to us with a comprehensive plan
Sure.
to deal with this challenge that recognizes we're not going to solve this problem in the next couple weeks or even in the next fiscal year. And so we need to have a plan not only that is comprehensive,
Sure.
but also is expansive in terms of time of implementation.
Okay. No, that makes perfect sense, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Vice Chairman Gross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a Public Safety Committee discussion. It could be a Budget Committee discussion, and I'd like to approach it from as Chair of the Personnel Committee.
Sure.
There have been years on this board where any kind of request for a position during carryover was dead on arrival, which is really the way it should be, is dead on arrival. So we need to be extremely careful, I think, when we're looking at positions in carryover, because as you said, and I was glad you had said that, these recurring positions, we have to pick up eventually we have to pick up the cost in a regular budget.
Right.
In the plan that was requested, I have a request for something else, and that is that when you have this many people being asked, for this kind of a request for this many people, that many of the people will be coming in as entry. This is assuming that we go forward, would be coming in as sort of an entry level, maybe even an entry level attorney. I don't know if there's such a thing as an entry level attorney, but at any rate, we have had a situation in this county where we hire people, we train them, and they get hired away in the private sector. So we are constantly having to rehire, and train again. So we need to have a plan in this plan about retention and how that will happen. But the other thing that I don't think has been included, because I think the $19.1 million that was mentioned is salary and benefits only, is it not? So you're asking for, another 3 times of the people you've got now overall. You got to have some place to put them.
Yes.
And I understand from a discussion that I had with Mr. Descano is that they're already putting people in closets because they don't have space for them to have desks and in a regular office.
Right.
So we need to also, part of the cost, what a huge cost, is going to be where to put folks, because you can't just add on to the courthouse or add on to a building easily.
Right.
That takes a lot of effort too. So let's make sure we don't, as we're going through with this,
Right.
let's make sure we're not just talking about bodies, we're talking about space.
Correct.
And these days, office space is even a different approach than we've had to do in the past. So
Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to just, those are questions, those are really just highlights that I'd like to make sure are included
Yes.
when we bring this back for a discussion.
And I will make the point that we have talked about space, so that is an issue that's been
Yes.
on the agenda, just so we're clear on that.
Yeah, it's
But
not a
you're
surprise to
exactly-
Steve.
You're exactly right. We do
Thank you.
need to have that delineated.
Thank
Okay, I'll move around. Supervisor Faust.
Thank you. A couple things. I would just say, with respect to the 15 staff, I don't want to suggest that our board is backing off on the advancement of the body worn cameras. I mean, that
Right.
is a decision we made,
Yeah.
and you're going to have to deal with that. I mean, formula gives you 15 additional people, which to me seems like a lot. You answered how many. Right now, there's about $138,000 per person, DMB estimated as the cost per person. And I'm wondering, was that based on all lawyers, or, how did you come up with that number? And Steve, what's your number? I mean, how many are lawyers of the 137, and how many are non-lawyers, staff people? You can go, and then hopefully
Would you like to have
DMB will.
DMB go first? Sure. I will say that Supervisor Faust, it is not based on all attorneys. Thank you. What we wanted to do again is try to stretch our non-attorney positions as much as possible, so that because we know that attorneys are going to be the most expensive, we tried to get the minimum number of attorneys as possible. And what I can tell you is we essentially end up with a 2.25 to 1 ratio. For the 137, that would be 87 attorneys, and 48 of those would be support staff. So again, you can see we did put thank you. We did put an emphasis on support staff, because there is so much work that they can pick up at a lower cost. And actually, quite frankly, that's not a shortcut. That actually leads to better service. Because quite frankly, one of the issues that we have even now is we have our police handling matters, such as subpoenas and reaching out to witnesses, that quite frankly should be done by paralegals in my office, but we just don't have the paralegals to do it. So that's one of the reasons, not only cost, but actually efficacy of how we do our work, that we're emphasizing support staff.
Joe, is that the ratio you used, or is
So,
are you comfortable with the number of average of $138,000 per year?
Yeah, so DMB worked closely with the Commonwealth Attorney's Office relative to the specific positions that were being identified for the various phases. And so that is salary and benefits, and it does include the range of the lower cost positions to the higher cost attorneys. What we can do, though, for a Q&A to the board is provide a detailed breakout by each of the tranches of positions, what that includes and what those costs are. And then just to revalidate what Supervisor Gross had indicated, those are all personnel costs. Those do not include estimated costs relative to additional space that would be needed to be phased in as positions were hired.
Okay. Chairman McKay nailed it in terms of what the next steps need to be. I think they actually should have been the first steps, maybe. We all got to come together, no surprises. I think you defined the problem, no question. I'm not sure you have identified the solution, but we definitely want to work with you to get to a point where, we're delivering the service in this county that people deserve and expect. Yeah.
Okay, Supervisor Harity.
Yeah, I've got a couple of comments and a couple of questions, and maybe start with slide 4, if somebody can pull that up. And I like the fact that this is in the Public Safety Committee, because I don't see slide 4. but there is, I think, only one jurisdiction on that slide that can say they're the safest jurisdiction of their size in the country, and that would be the one at the top. And whatever we do, we need to make sure that we don't impact that.
Yes.
And unfortunately, I think we are, for a whole host of reasons. I'll stick to the one that's in front of us right now, though. And let me just ask, and I would echo the chairman's comment, we do need a plan, because this is impacting a bunch of different people. We can't look at one facet of this, but I'm not all the way there yet that we've got the problem that's been described. So I guess my first question, I think this is correct. If body-worn camera footage is presented, so if we go ahead with the body-worn camera, the Commonwealth Attorney is going to have to deal with that.
Right.
Unfortunately, what that means, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that means two things. We get backlogged if he doesn't have enough staff, or things get pushed off. Is that correct?
That's correct, Supervisor. We have to deal with all the body-worn camera footage as evidence.
Regardless, yep. How is the Commonwealth Attorney's case workload been under COVID? Is it gone down, stayed the same? I understand the actual cases that are being tried are significantly reduced. Is that correct? And do you have numbers on that?
I don't have numbers on that, but what I can tell you is that the work of the work of the courthouse has slowed dramatically. So, for example, one of the things that has been kind of spoken about that I should have made clear is when we made our announcement that we were changing our caseload, that was in addition to staying in all the cases, the misdemeanor cases that had been backlogged for months. And we're still working through that backlog of cases now on the misdemeanor side. As far as the cases, misdemeanors actually getting done in the courthouse, they're also getting done at a slower pace. I think we've seen that misdemeanor arrests during COVID have decreased. But as far as felonies, the felony level hasn't appreciably changed. But again, the trial of them has appreciably changed because we've had a 7-month break, and which will not start up again until November.
See, and that kind of goes to, and I appreciate Chief Rohr talking about timing, and we've always had a strong partnership between FCPD and the Commonwealth Attorneys and our whole judicial system, but I just have a hard time understanding how all of a sudden we went to a hard stop on this. And that leaves us very little room to react, for our police department to react, our victim services to react, our whole county to react. When volume is down in the courthouse, you would think that we would have the time to work through some of these details and the plan that the chairman's recommending, so that we could actually deal with it. But on the and I also want to thank Deputy County Rohr on his statement on ethics. And maybe we do need a closed session, and I wouldn't mind a closed session, because if we had errors there, I'm born and raised here, but I guess I have a little bit of Missouri blood in me, because I think I need to be shown where the ethical issues were before, and not just the one or two off, but where they were, because I had not heard that before today. Not today, but before this issue came up. And I think we ought to peel the skin on that onion a little bit. A couple more questions and I'll move on. We've always had a fine tradition in Fairfax County of our Commonwealth Attorney actually handling cases. Does our current Commonwealth Attorney plan to handle cases?
I think I've been very clear, and this was the position I took even during the campaign, was that the role of the actual elected Commonwealth Attorney is not to do cases in a large jurisdiction like this. Quite frankly, when we take a look at the shortfall that we have for staffing, one additional attorney in the office one additional attorney in the courtroom does not solve that issue. I really do believe that there is a reason that this position is elected, that it has the responsibility that it does. It's not to be a super prosecutor and do the same work as the 32 line attorneys in the office, but it's to actually lead the office to, quite frankly, to uncover issues such as this one that affect the entire community and serve the entire community as opposed to doing as a whole, as opposed to doing that case by case.
Number two question: we've had a tradition of having a deputy Commonwealth attorney that handles a significant caseload. We now have a new position of chief of staff. Is that chief of staff an attorney, and is he planned to handle cases or no?
The chief of staff is not an attorney. And like many things in the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office that I hope that this presentation has showed, is that the old ways of doing things are behind the times and leave our community vulnerable. It leaves our office with a lot of things falling through the cracks. I know that you, Supervisor, very much value having a chief of staff as you have one yourself. I think that the value that you see in having a chief of staff is the same value that I would see in having a chief of staff, particularly with the size of the office and the number of staff that I have.
I think we have a lot of work to do here. I would like to see, I'd like to dig into the question that was raised on ethics and what we were doing so wrong in our past. That didn't work because clearly with the partnership that we had between the PD and the Commonwealth Attorney, we were the safest jurisdiction of our size in the country, and I think we need to work to stay there.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Harity. Mr. Walkinshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Descano, thank you for the detailed presentation and for the time you've spent, I think, with many of us going through this. Obviously, we're all experiencing a bit of sticker shock. I just have a question on workload related to marijuana arrests, and specifically the arrests for simple possession of marijuana. Presumably, your predecessor for years, his prosecutors were involved in some of those prosecutions, and there was a workload there. With the decriminalization of marijuana as of July 1, you have a backlog of some offenses that happened previous to that, but there's going to be some date certain in the future where the last arrest for simple possession of small amounts of marijuana will be dealt with in that courthouse. And I just want to know, have your projections in terms of workload taken that into account, and how do you see that reducing the workload?
That's a great question. And I know that those prosecutions are the change in that law is very important to me. I believe it's very important to you as well. The projections do take into account that change in workload. I will tell you very frankly that it will be a minimal change in workload, because one of the issues that is driving this need and the change is that, quite frankly, misdemeanor cases were not prepared in all cases, as a rule, as thoroughly as I think that we would expect. So while those cases are going away, there is not a lot of time saved, because there is not a lot of time spent in the preparation of those cases before going to court. And those cases while in court, tend to be very, very quick events.
That's all. Okay, thank you. Supervisor Alcorn.
Thank you. Yeah, just to build a little bit on what the chairman said about a plan, I guess the one thing that really comes home to me during this discussion is that whenever we're asked to vote on the budget, we're asked to vote on something and we're told what it would do, and if we don't know what actually we're voting on will do in terms of the purpose of those additional positions in particular, it really undermines our entire budget process. And I realize this is a little different, because this is not these are not expenditures that are, directly under the county executive. This is a constitutional officer who's coming in with a new way of doing business and is changing a lot of things. So I realize there may be a transition point underway, but I just want to make sure that when we actually vote on carryover, if we're adding new positions, I want to make sure that there's an understanding what those folks will be doing and what their intent is. So that would be sort of a threshold thing for me. Thank you.
Well, Supervisor Alcorn, I think that is, I agree with you. I think, my role here, I always wanted to, and I endeavored to, and will continue to endeavor to explicitly tell the board what every position would do and what we would be asking for. The one thing I did want to mention is that the need for additional resources, it's not philosophical. It's not based on how we're prosecuting, outside of just the bounds of what it actually takes to do cases properly.
Thank you, Supervisor Alcorn. Supervisor Palchik.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Steve, Mr. Descano, for being here. And I think my first response is looking at this both comprehensively and what seems to be to need a multi-year plan, right? We are facing many emergencies right now. I'm trying to keep people out of the court system, trying to keep them from being evicted, trying to make sure they can feed their families and have a roof over their heads. So I know there's so much that we care about, which is why we're here and want to make sure that we're doing what's best for our community. And so there is no easy solution, but it does seem that this being brought as an emergency is maybe added to many of the emergencies that we're seeing at the moment. And so I do agree with my colleagues that we need to, look at it comprehensively and have a plan and understand what that staffing will cover. And I do appreciate you taking the time to meet with me ahead of the meeting. I did have one leftover question, I think, from our conversation, especially as we're talking about cases and workload. I believe you mentioned a desire to want to go back and review some past cases and that had been previously prosecuted. So as we are talking about caseload, if you could speak, today a little bit more to what you are looking at in that research and in your desire to have that review, because my understanding is that that would be adding to that workload as well.
I appreciate that question, Supervisor Palchik, because it is a great point. We did speak about that. What I can tell you is that, again, based on the projections that I put forward, that this is meat and potatoes only. This does not include a conviction integrity unit or anything backward looking. So the presentation is all for caseload that is occurring. I know one of the things that we talked about in terms of going back and looking at cases, it was not a desire that I had to look at them, but in doing this research, finding cases that were troubling and trying to untie certain issues that should never have gotten as far with cases as they went. Again, without, I can't get into too much detail with that, but it just rest assured that some of the things that I found did distress me. That was why I was looking at some of those cases that came across my desk that were distressing, but everything that we put in this projection is for work forward, because it's just meat and potatoes prosecution. Because I can appreciate, and I do know how hard it must be to be a board member right now, just dealing with crisis after crisis, and the tough decisions that you have to make.
No, and I appreciate that. So I guess to say everything you're presenting and the need for additional staffing is all tied to work that you feel to be better done going forward. It is not for looking at past cases.
Correct. All of the staff members that we're presenting here are for projective work, forward-looking work, none for backward-looking work. Of course, that would be a great thing to have. That would be a nice to have. But I think in this moment of crisis, it behooves everyone to be talking about the needs to have as opposed to the wants to have.
Exactly.
No, I appreciate that. And I do think, obviously, a comprehensive look and a plan. I do hope that your office is able to work with the county staff to make that plan.
I pledge to you all that I will. I always endeavor to be a partner with the county and to be as transparent and honest with everyone so that you all can make the decisions that you feel are right for the community. And I pledge that myself and my staff will work tirelessly in the working group or any other county stakeholders, because I think at the end of the day, we're all on the same team, and I think we all want the same thing, which is safe community and services for our constituents.
Thank you, Supervisor Palchak. Supervisor Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do appreciate this presentation, and I, to be honest, if I hadn't gotten some preview of this, I would have been totally shocked. As it is, I'm still shocked and still trying to figure out how we got here, I guess. And the bottom line is, as a numbers, a data guy, it's tough to refute what's in front of me, although in the end, I look at we're the safest jurisdiction of our size in the country, and that's the other kind of part of this. So I'm very supportive of taking a deeper dive and making sure that we ensure that we have the finest Commonwealth Attorney's Office in the state for sure, and if that means additional resources in order to protect and ensure justice, I'm all in. Balancing that with the other challenges that we have, which we've heard earlier today, as well as we are going to hear in the next committee presentation after this, I think will further give us pause for concern. Although my biggest worry right now, frankly, is the justice delayed and denied right now. We have people in our community, victims in our community that are waiting for something to happen. We have people who have been accused of things that they either believe they didn't do it or recognize that they did it and are wanting to know where they are so they can move on with their lives. So I'm not blaming anybody, but this is a terrible situation for us all to be in, and it's not a healthy situation for our society, and one that whatever we can do, whatever your office can do, and the courts can do to expedite getting back to normal, if you will, was appreciated, and then working that backlog down as quickly as possible. So I'm looking forward to taking a deeper dive. I recognize that, again, I don't see, if somebody in the community or somebody on this board or somebody on our staff can show me where there's errors in these numbers, please, I challenge you to show those to me, because I want to understand that, because what I see in front of me is fairly convincing, at least in terms of where the office is in relation to its similar kinds of offices. But again, I balance that with what we have had for so many years, and our police force has done such an incredible job of getting and keeping us here, which is the safest jurisdiction of our size. So looking forward to further conversation, and clearly I'm supportive of doing something to ensure that we address and ensure that justice gets provided sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Stork. Supervisor Smith.
Thank you. I appreciate that we're going to step back and take a look at this and come up with a plan. And I think one of the things that's obvious that came out of the conversation is everybody wants to serve the community well. The police want to serve the community well, Commonwealth Attorney's Office, and the board. And I think it was a difficulty that this kind of came up so quickly that people couldn't prepare for it. And so I think that's going to be an important part moving forward, that everybody is in a position to do their job well.
Yes.
With the expectation of the commitment that the board made to body-worn cameras. So we're all going to have to figure out how we move forward to serve the community well. So I appreciate the discussion. I think it was important to get it all out in the open. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Smith. We are over our appointed time. Every single member of this body got an opportunity to speak. Thank you very much, Mr. Discano, for coming and presenting today, and thank you to the staff. We know what our marching orders are, so we'll coordinate with the chairman and county attorney, county executive, deputy county executive, Roar, and the chief of police, and others. Will determine who they are for this working group to develop the plan that the chairman has referenced. So with that, I will call the meeting adjourned. Thank you very much.